In this lesson, we'll learn how to select and transform our vector shapes inside of Illustrator. Alright, so in the last lesson we learned about kind of how the anatomy of vector shapes breaks down and what the key components of those objects are. So this is the lesson 4 begin file. If you want to follow along with me, feel free to check your project files. And I want to talk a little bit about selecting these vector shapes. You'll notice here I've been using this black arrow to sort of point out and annotate everything that's going on the screen while I'm doing it. Now this is actually one of Illustrator's selection tools, and it's right over here in the tool panel. You can see up here in the very top left hand corner, this black arrow is called the selection tool. Now the selection tool is really one of the main tools you'll use, but what it is meant to select are individual objects. Now whether that object consists of maybe just a single path, or maybe that object is actually a group of objects and it consists of multiple paths. This selection tool is meant to select just objects and groups of objects. So if we look over here on my artboard right here, you'll see we have this sort of this orange shape, and this is actually made up of multiple shapes. And if I go ahead and click on one of these with my selection tool, you'll notice here that we get sort of this blue outline around the shape. So this is the object edge, and when I select it, you can actually see each of the individual anchor points on that object. Now you'll also notice that there's sort of this rectangular shaped box that appeared around the object as well. This is referred to in Illustrator as a bounding box, and this is really used for transforming objects, but we're going to look at that here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and stick to selections for right now. So right now I have this entire slice of the orange selected. Now with it selected, I can come over here with my selection tool and I can click and I can drag. I can move that around. We can do anything we want to with that object selected. But we have the entire object selected. Now we can also select individual anchor points and paths of an object, and that actually uses this little tool right next to the selection tool. This is called a direct selection tool. Easy way to remember that name is that we're being more direct about what we're selecting. We're actually selecting things that make up an object. So right now I have this leaf shape selected. Let me zoom in on that. I'm holding Control and Spacebar to zoom in, and you can see again we have the edges of the object, and we have the individual anchor points. Now when I select this direct selection tool, you'll notice that the bounding box disappears. If we were to click on that selection tool again, that bounding box is going to come back. Now if you're not seeing your bounding box or your object edges for some reason, you might check up under the View menu and make sure that this option right here is enabled for showing the bounding box. Mine says Hide Bounding Box because that's what I would select if I wanted to hide it. Now also up here, this option right here is the option that would turn on the object edges. So now with the direct selection tool, again we can select individual pieces of this object. So I could come in here and I could select just the anchor point right there, and you can see that there was a slight visual change. Let me just go over to the orange object. I think it'll be a little bit easier to see. So there's keyboard shortcuts to alternate back and forth between these two selection tools. For the selection tool here, the keyboard shortcut is V, and for the direct selection tool, the keyboard shortcut is A. So I want to use V, and I'm going to select this big circle right here. And then I'll switch to the direct selection tool with the keyboard shortcut A. And you can see here that right now we have the entire object selected. But if we wanted to select just this anchor point right here, I mouse over that and the cursor changes just slightly and has that little empty box next to it. That indicates that I'm mousing over that anchor point. So I go ahead and click on that, and you can see we get the control handles that we learned about in the previous lesson. And because I have this particular anchor point selected, we can also see one control handle from this anchor point and one control handle from this anchor point as well. So now the reason we would want to maybe select individual pieces of an object is if we wanted to modify just those pieces. So I could come in here with this anchor point selected, and I can click and I can drag that, and we can start to modify this shape. Maybe we had a shape that was a little more oblong like this, and we wanted to get that down into a little bit more of a circular shape so that we have a little bit more of a round shape for our orange. So now we can also use a little different method than just clicking on an anchor point to select it. We can also use what's known as a marquee selection. So the difference is a marquee selection, maybe we wanted to select 2 anchor points. Let me just come in here and select this entire object and this anchor point right here and this anchor point. Maybe we wanted to select multiple anchor points. So again, with our direct selection tool, I'm going to come over here and I'm just simply going to click outside of the shape, and I'm going to, with my mouse button held down, I'm going to drag a square here around both of the 2 anchor points that I want to target. You can see here that little square that I'm dragging out has sort of a dashed line around it. This is referred to as a marquee selection. So if I come in here and I release right about there, what I've done is I've selected both of these 2 anchor points. So now I can click and I can drag and I can move both of those 2 anchor points around. All right. So let me undo that. Undo in Illustrator is simply Control Z. Now, not only can we select individual anchor points with the direct selection tool, but we can also select individual path segments. Now, remember, a path segment is the span of a path that is between 2 adjacent anchor points right here. So if I come in with my direct selection tool, I can also come in and click on just that segment right there. And I could drag a marquee selection around it. You can see that there was just a slight visible change, being that we can see one control handle off of each of those anchor points. Now, the reason why we would want to select a path segment, maybe we wanted to open this closed path up. Remember, we learned about the difference between an opened and a closed path. So maybe we wanted to open this path up. We could select a path segment right here and delete that with our delete key, just like so. And you can see here that part of the path has been deleted. Now, I don't actually want to do that. Let me undo that here. What I'd rather do, let's go ahead and maybe select a different path segment, one that has a little bit more distance between the 2 anchor points. We can also click on an individual path segment with our direct selection tool, and we can actually drag that around, and we can modify our shape just simply by dragging the path segment. You can see here, as I drag this around, watch what happens to the 2 control handles that affect this portion of the path. You can see that the angle of these 2 control handles is not changing at all. What is changing is their length. So if I click and I drag, we could shorten those 2 handles up if I drag down, or we could really make those nice and long if I drag this up. Now, you want to be really careful in how you actually drag these path segments, because if you drag this too far, you're going to start to get strange overlaps in the path, which can create some really unexpected results. Let me just click away, and you can see here that there's a loop that's formed in the path right here. And we've got actually a fill color, which we're going to learn about when we talk about attributes for vector objects. But there's a fill color of this orange assigned to this object, and because of that, and because this path makes sort of this loop right here, we get sort of this, what looks like a completely separate shape. So just something to be on the lookout for when you're modifying your vector shapes. So with that said, let's go ahead and zoom out here, and that's Control, Alt, and Spacebar. And I'm going to select my selection tool again, and let's go ahead and maybe select one of these wedges here, maybe this one right here. Now, remember this bounding box that we learned about earlier in this lesson? This bounding box is actually a really useful tool for making basic transformations to an object. We can actually come in here and we can grab any one of these little white handles around the perimeter of our bounding box, and we could make changes. We could grab this one and we can move it in or up, just like so. And you can see how that's changing our shape. Now, these ones on the outside, if I grab that, there's a little bit more versatility with these corner controls on the bounding box. You can see we can enlarge the object in size. We can also stretch it both to the right and as well as up and down. So now there's actually some keyboard shortcuts that you should be aware of when making bounding box transformations like this. So if we were to hold down the Shift key, what that's going to do as we drag, say, this corner control, is it's going to scale the object. So you'll notice that before I was holding the Shift key, we were actually deforming the shape of the object. It was changing that. Now instead, we're just simply scaling this object up. It still maintains the same shape, it's just bigger. So if I undo that a couple times, we can actually hold down the Shift key and do the same thing with these handles that are in the center of the corners. So we can hold down Shift, and it's going to maintain the original shape. It's just going to scale it up or scale it down. Now, as I grab maybe this corner right here and hold Shift, you'll notice that there seems to be sort of an anchor point for this object in this lower left corner as I'm scaling it up. Now, we can actually control that. So if we wanted this object to scale up from the center of the object, the Alt key on your keyboard is actually going to control that. So if we were to hold down the Alt key and then grab this corner transform control, you can see here that now we're making changes based on the center of the object. Now, I didn't hold down the Shift key there, I just held down the Alt key, but we can actually combine those two keys. So if I were to hold down Shift and Alt at the same time, we would scale this object up from its center. And you can see it's just much larger, and it's been scaled up from the center there. So now these are basic bounding box transformations, and we're making all of these with our selection tool. Now, there's actually a number of different, what I would call transformation tools here inside of Illustrator. Most of them are going to live right around in this area. These little tools right here with these little white arrows in the lower right-hand corner, you can actually click on those and hold down with your mouse, and you can see there's actually multiple tools nested underneath those. So you can see there is a tool for rotating objects, there's a tool for reflecting objects, there are tools over here, if we click and hold down, for scaling an object. You can see for shearing an object, and then reshaping. Now, we don't have time to go into all of these tools in this particular lesson, but I wanted to just show you how you can make some basic transformations to an object using the selection tool. Now, one last transformation that we didn't talk about with the bounding box is the ability to rotate the object. So if I were to mouse around this corner right here, you'll see that my cursor changes to this little curved arrow. Now, if I were to click and drag, we're going to begin to rotate that object, just like so. Now, the same keyboard shortcuts apply to rotating an object. If I were to hold down the Shift key and do that, you're going to notice here that something a little different happens. Instead of scaling or transforming the object, what we're doing is we're locking the rotation to 45-degree increments here. So I can hold down Shift, and you can see it's kind of ticking around at 45-degree increments. So that was just one last basic transformation that we can make using the selection tool and an object's bounding box. So what I would do in between lessons, go ahead and take this simple orange object and practice selecting different pieces of it, as well as transforming those using the bounding box around each of those objects. When you're done, go ahead and move on to the next lesson, and we're going to focus strictly on anchor points and how do we control the flow of a path through an anchor point.